we are going to start the second session discussing the hiring practices for getting a job in the international sector. So we're going to have all of the panelists come back on, and we're going to make everyone visible so that we can I'm sorry, no, we're not going to make everyone visible. We'll just make one person visible at a time. Just Rune, to start us off, we have one question specifically for you. And so we'll go one by one, and then we'll jump back into that big global environment with everybody in just a few minutes. So again, anyone who has questions about the hiring practices of how do you get your foot in the door, how do you network, please put your questions into the Q&A feature, which our lovely Q&A lead, Marian, is handling. And so Rune, my first question is to you. You've had a lot of people ask you this question about networking to get on the inside of an international organization. And some people are hesitant to do this kind of networking and outreach before applying for a job. So from your point of view, what are the advantages of contacting strangers who work at the organization where you want to apply?
Yes, and this is a hard question with no easy answer, because when you work in the UN, you are targeted by people who wants to see if you can help them enter, and that's why we're doing this webinar. That's because people want to enter, but you are very often not in a position to hire, and you are sometimes not even in a position to help hire or help access, because that will skew the process and it won't be fair, and you'll get penalized, and the person you're trying to help will end up not being helped at all. So that's one aspect to know. But those are certain jobs.
You mentioned something about penalties. Could you just touch on that and explain what you mean by that before you jump ahead?
When you are hired in the UN, you are required to follow certain procedures in terms of hiring and people who wants to access. Mm-hmm. And that one of those things is that you can't perform preferential treatment. And that's really important. So if I'm just saying, no, I can't help you on a LinkedIn text or something, it might not be cute because I'm a bad person or really don't want to help you. It might be because if I start helping you and people find out I helped you, then you will be in a bad position and I'll be in a bad position. So that's valuable to know that there is this balance, but that all comes down to what kind of jobs you're applying for, because I definitely see this playing out, but I also see playing out when I was in UNEP. We often have so much work to do and so short time to do it in that we hire external consultants, writers, helpers of some sort. And the UN process formally is very, very, very tiresome and long. So we don't have time to that. Sometimes it's just ask 3 people, can you do this? Choose one of them if they can, hire them on the spot as an external consultant or writer or some sort. So that's a way in. But that might not be when you are asking. So you might send an application our way and we might see it and we might think, hey, that's interesting, but we might not have anything that we can do at that particular moment. Mm-hmm. So I think that's important to know, that there might be a ton of goodwill on the other end, but that's not what will be shown.
Right. And what if the person is in a different department in the same organization? Could someone outside of that hiring unit potentially communicate with you about working for the organization? Could you get help from a different unit, for example?
Well, that might be an issue, that you are getting help from a different unit, definitely.
It would be an issue,
I would
so
say that maybe Niki or Brent or Sophie can answer that better than I can. But yeah, there's definitely room for helping, but not necessarily with particular positions. Okay. There are some issues around that in international organizations, but simply sharing a resume or something along those lines can definitely get you a long way. especially if, it's a good one. If you are still, just out of university, of education, Niki might be able to speak more to how to enter in that way. But yeah, it's a tricky one. For me, I applied to a totally different position when I entered, and my resume was handed by hand from different people until somebody said, "Hey, that's the guy we need." So that was very random, really, and it might have turned out completely different, and I would never have known. Yeah.
Right. So it sounds like you're saying there are some concerns about people helping you, but you can still talk to people. You can still have conversations with people, right? So do you want to add to that? I was going to ask Sophie a follow-up question to that.
Please.
Yeah? All right, so Sophie, come on up. I want to ask you a follow-up question to this. You can reach out to people. And so what if you found someone you do want to talk to, they're on the inside of the organization you want to work for? What is the best approach to adopt when you're contacting these people, especially given what Rune just said?
Thanks, Tammy. Yeah, I think that's a very key point. I'm sure all of us, the panelists, we get these messages on LinkedIn once in a while. And I would say when reaching out to someone on LinkedIn, firstly, I'd say LinkedIn is a very good platform to do this. But secondly, when reaching out to someone on LinkedIn, I think it's really good to keep in mind that these people are very busy. As Brent was mentioning earlier, these are jobs that can sometimes be all-consuming. So, I would recommend that you come to these people with a specific ask, because I sometimes get messages that are like, "Oh, I'd love to talk to you about your work." And that's nice in theory. I'd also love to do that. But the reality is like, this is too vague of an ask for me to commit time to. I think if you reach out to someone with a specific ask, you get a better chance of having an answer. And a specific ask could be, for instance, okay, let's say in my case, I worked for WWF. Someone reaches out to me and says, I've seen this WWF job. I'm not sure I meet all the criteria, but what do you think? I've also worked in this and this. Do you think it's useful for me to highlight this kind of skill or this experience, or put forward that kind of example in this application? Do you think that's something that would land well with this team at WWF? I might not be able to reply, but at least I can, provide some guidance and tell you, based on my experience, I think this kind of experience, yes, it's valued in the organization because of X, Y, Z. Something specific like this, it will be easier to get a conversation going. Second point to keep in mind is also when you're reaching out to these people. And with this, I would be very mindful to avoid reaching out at times where you know that climate communications people are going to be very busy. So that includes COP, for instance. We're just out of COP. That's a moment where we will not reply to you because we're just in over our heads. So I would say all of the 2 weeks leading up to COP and during COP is not a good time to reach out. And there's other moments like this, like September, there's the UN General Assembly, there's Climate Week. That's also usually a very busy time, and that's not a good time to reach out. So just do a bit of research, know your audience. If you know that the person you want to reach out is currently working on a really big conference, wait a couple of weeks before reaching out.
Thank you so much for sharing. That's really helpful. I think there's a lot of really excellent pieces of advice in there. And the idea of being really specific about your ask, I cannot encourage that enough. If someone were to come to me and say, "Can we have a call sometime?" That's truly not specific enough. It's, "Can we have a 15-minute call on Tuesday next week after your lunchtime?" Right? Oh, that's very specific. I can look at my calendar and see if after my lunchtime it's going to work for this person. And I can say, yes, 3 o'clock. And then, we can move on from there. So I think there's some really good, it's really good to be very precise about the ask and exactly what you want to know from that individual. And managing the schedules, like you mentioned, is critically valuable. So thank you so much, Sophie. I'd like to jump over. So Brent, I wanted to jump to Brent, but it looks like Rune has something he wants to add here. Come on up, Rune.
Very, very short. Check what time zone people are in before asking for a specific time slot.
Yes.
The conversations I have had explaining people my time zone and why I can't talk at a particular time has taken more than the actual conversation.
Right.
So
Right.
please check what time zone people are in, make considerations about their work-life schedule, and maybe find somewhere that would be suitable.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
Really good point. I'm glad you mentioned it. The idea hit my head and then I didn't say it. I'm so glad you said that because it's critically important. All right. Thank you so much, Sophie and Rune. Let's jump into the next question with Brent. So, Brent, the attendees might be wondering how they should contact people within these organizations. So, should they use a phone number? Should they find a phone number? Should they use LinkedIn, an email address? What's the best way to contact people?
Okay. First, I want to say I don't want to go after Rune and Sophia anymore because they took all the good lines. I wanted to talk about what a terrible thing it is to get a message from somebody that says, could I have just an hour to pick your brain in the next 10 minutes? Like, nope, being picked clean at the moment by my entire organization. That just doesn't work. But let's talk about things that do work. And I don't want to repeat what has already been said. So let me try and be a little approach this from a different way. I think that when we're talking about applying and talking to people, we have to take a step back. Your application really begins years before you apply. Do you have a great LinkedIn profile? Do you have a strong resume that is flawless, not one spelling mistake on it? Do you have a portfolio of speeches, of press releases, of op-eds that are ready to go if I ask for them in 10 minutes? That's one thing that needs to be done. Do you know how to talk about yourself in a line or 2 lines that instantly connects, right? Because we're talking about time being of the essence and those sorts of things. I think you have to have everything set up, ready to go. You have to know who you are. So do that footwork before. And that also includes, by the way, we've not talked about interviews. We've talked about one bit of the application process, and that's the front end. But if you go further along, let's say you're even cleared beyond that first line, I think that you want to take as many interviews as you can and go through this process as many times as possible, because the interviews are a whole different thing. There's a system that you have to know to answer these questions. What is it? Somebody help me. It's the CAN or CAR, challenge, action that you took, and the response that resulted, or the result. So there's a definite way to know these. Now, there is training on the UN website. There's a jobs website for the UN. There are tutorials on there to walk you through those. I highly suggest you do those. Let me just, I made a list because communications. Email definitely is the best way, but be precise, as already has, it's been mentioned already. There's no way I can tell you what the job is going, the ins and outs, and is this job really for somebody else is a question I often get. There's no way I can answer those things for people. But here's the thing. Why don't you, as communicators, get in touch with the person, especially if somebody leaving a job. So if there's a speechwriting job available, one of the first things I'm going to do, I'm not going to try and talk to the communications director through a personal email. They're not going to respond. They're just not going to. I want to talk to that speechwriter. Why are they leaving? Was this place hell? What's the approvals process? What's the team like? All of those things, because maybe that saves me a lot of work. Maybe I don't want that job. So that's one thing. And usually if the person's leaving, they're more than happy to talk often, whether it's to air grievances. It's not often the case, but just they'll be a little more open, I think. So I think that's an important thing to do. And I know I've actually hired people on a contracting basis. I've sat on some job interviews. I'm happy to talk about contracting, but I think that might be coming up shortly, Tammy. I'm not sure, but I'm willing to.
Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about that specifically when we're all in a big group. Yeah.
Then let me stop there. So just be precise and targeted and get to the point. If you're sending an email, just let me know what you want, and I'm happy to talk if I have time.
Absolutely. I have two things to follow up on that, because I think what you said is really interesting, and it reminds me of some experiences I've had in particular with both the my hiring process when I was hired at different organizations. So first, when I found out that there was a job that I was interested in, I actually contacted people that I knew in the organization just to say, hey, can I have a 15-minute call to talk a little about your experience working here and this new position that's opened up, to find out more about that how that fits into the organization itself. I get on the 15-minute call. Oh, by the way, I sent those emails. So they were emails to one organization. To another organization, I didn't have his email, so I used LinkedIn. It depends on the person, depends on if you have access. And so I sent these messages. I was able to get 15-minute phone calls. I asked really precise questions about what was their experience like and what they knew about this particular position that was opened up. And I also asked some critical questions about, so what are the challenges that this organization is facing, for example? And that helped me write a much better cover letter, because I was adapting my cover letter and my experience to the specific problems that the organization was having. And for those two applications, I sent the application after having had those meetings and got interviews in both of those cases, for example. So highly recommend that. And there's a quick message in the chat that I just want to jump in on. Sophie, do you want to jump in and say something here? And so Brent, I'm going to have you jump off. Sophie, come on in. And then I've got Niki, a question up for you. Thanks so much, Brent.
Yeah, thank you, Tammy. I just want to reinforce Brett's points on prepping. Prepping your interviews is so key. Having a little paragraph, your own little pitch, elevator pitch, how have you packaged your experience? And these things don't come naturally. I mean, they might come naturally to some people. They certainly don't come naturally to me. So you have to prep them, rehearse them, and do them. And I think it's also really good to have a portfolio of your achievements. I have a simple portfolio. I'm happy to share it with the participants later. And it just shows that you've thought through about it. You just have these examples to show at hand, and it makes a big difference. I've had good feedback on adding my portfolio to my applications. And when I've hired people, having a good portfolio really helps make your application stand out.
Thank you so much for mentioning this. So I have the text that you just sent me, and I'm going to add it to the follow-up email so everyone can check out your portfolio in the follow-up email that they'll get later this week. All right, great. Thanks so much. All right, so let's jump over to Niki. I have a question that I'd like to ask her about her experience joining the UN environment. So Niki, you joined as an intern and then joined the United Nations Volunteers Program. So there's a lot of people in the audience who might be interested in joining UNV. So what was that hiring process like in that experience? Tell us a little bit about it.
Sure, thanks. If you don't mind, I'd like to backtrack a bit on how I became an intern. And like everyone has alluded to, it's a process. So I think I did around 400 applications. But not just to the UN, but all over. And it took a lot of learning, getting feedback from people who were willing to give it. To understand how to improve my applications, and it is a bit of a numbers game. Like, there are so many qualified people out there who are amazing, and it's also about being in the right place at the right time, in a way. So I managed to secure my internship, and whilst I was an intern, I was, after those 400 applications, I was just very grateful to be there. So I did everything I could, to learn and embrace that opportunity to the fullest. I tried to speak. I tried to speak and have coffees with everyone, not with the intention of asking them to give me a job, but to understand what they do and create a connection, which may be helpful at a later stage, but that was not the intention. It was but I would suggest, if you're joining somewhere, to do that, like Brent said at the beginning, to build connections. And so after a while, there was a need arose for this position that my first position at UNEP, which was and so they I was encouraged to apply. I signed up on the UNBV platform, and after the full process, I managed to secure the UNV. But it did help that I already had my feet in the door, and yeah, that's the process.
Great. Thank you so much, Niki. And so when it came to have you had a chance to network yourself? Did you do any networking when it came to these roles?
Yeah, I did do some networking. I tried to work. I mean, like colleagues have mentioned in the in this webinar, there are busy moments throughout the year, and also and that's an opportunity. So as an intern, I've offered support to different teams, and that helped me to build trust and show them my working style, and also, and it gave me the opportunity to.
Oh, I think she might be frozen, unless it's me. Now I can see Brent moving, so it's not me. Oh, Niki, you might be frozen right now. So what I'd like to do actually is invite everyone up. So if we can get everyone up on the stage. So hopefully Niki will come back to us in a moment. In the meantime, I'd like to extend that same question out to Brent and Sophie. There are a number of questions about this networking process. And one of those questions, let me zoom to it. I've got a number of questions that have come in, which is great. I'm really excited about all these different ideas people have. So what about working for smaller companies? Are there any networking, do you have any networking advice for working for smaller companies or organizations? Sophie? Brent?
Yeah,
Sure.
sorry. Sorry. Go ahead, Brent.
No, you go ahead. I'm waiting. I like your answers.
I think I was just gonna say that for smaller companies, I think actually Niki's advice applies to as well, is especially in smaller companies, it's good to be flexible with what you're offering and to know that you might be needed here and there. And if you're starting in your career, it's a great way to learn, and it's a great way to build some experience and build good relationship. Obviously, you want to also at some point set some boundaries and not, be overwhelmed with the work and overwork yourself. But I think being flexible in your approach and being helpful can go a very, very long way.
Okay. I think I was next up, and once again, Sophie stole my answer. Thanks a lot, Sophie. No, it's true. I've also worked after UNFCCC. I had a chance to work with 1.5, which is a organization headed up by the former Executive Secretary of UNFCCC, and there I went from a team of how many? A couple hundred people, obviously more than that, to an organization I think of about 10 to 15 people, and it was a very different thing. It's a very interesting place to work, but I think I think this really works well at the beginning of a career. It's helpful if you're looking for places to volunteer. As Sophie said, this is a great opportunity to work and get some practical experience. But make no mistake, these companies are also very, very busy. They may not have a lot of time to train you. They're not necessarily training organizations, but there's probably an opportunity in these organizations to do more than one thing. Whereas at the UN, boy, that Niki, I sympathize with your 400 applications. That internship program, I have mixed feelings on that. I think it's terrible that they don't get paid. I think you should get paid for the work that you do. To a certain extent, training is very necessary. But that was one of the problems I always had with the UN, was that they didn't pay the interns. So it depends. It depends. I think at the beginning of one's career, it's always helpful to do some work on a volunteer basis just to begin a portfolio, but try to get paid when you can.
So important. I know, Rune, you had something you wanted to say. Did you want to add anything, or can we jump to another question?
Please jump. I think I got covered by the two panelists before me.
All right, great. So there's a couple different questions that I want to ask here, and I want to make sure we have time for all of them. Like a ton of different really good questions have come in, right? And so some people are interested in how to transition from outside of the climate space or outside of the UN space. One person is 45 years old, has never worked in the space. You know, there's these kind of questions that are coming in. There's also some questions about working as a contractor. How do you manage that? How do you get in as a contractor? And there's also some questions about working remotely. How do you get a job working remotely? And are there any tips for finding remote jobs in particular in this space? Then there's also some questions that have come in around like the skills to highlight in a CV and the experience that someone needs. Does someone need to have experience outside of comms? Should they only have comms as their background? So the variety of questions is impressive. So I'd like to start with I'd like to start with the contracting question, right? So if you could talk to me a little bit about the difficulty. So I know it's difficult to sometimes get a permanent staff position in one of these organizations. So a permanent position being there's no end date, right? You're just on staff, no end date to your contract. And sometimes it's easier to come in with a contract which could be renewable for many, many years. And it could be at some point that you become a permanent staff person after a while. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on this process of becoming a contractor and what it looks like once you're in that position. So Niki, I saw your hand go up. Why don't you start?
Thanks. I put it up by mistake, but I'll just share some thoughts. It is very difficult to get a permanent position. So just so you know, the UNV is a good option to start with, and like I said, through the UNV you get access to people, and like Rune said, you can't there. It's a line you have to thread carefully where you can't explicitly ask for help, but you could share your CV, share your experience, and share what you would be interested in, so that in the future, if the role does come up, you could apply and then mention to the people in the corridor that you have applied, and if they could watch out for your application. But if you're a consultant, which I am right now, you can't, in the Secretariat, which is UNEP, UN Habitat, and the UN, you're not allowed to apply for staff positions, so permanent positions, for at least 6 months after you have a contract. So that's something to keep in mind. But I do think it's a good stepping stone. And I think yeah, like I think there are lots of opportunities in the other positions, but also difficulties. It takes some sacrifice sometimes.
That's an important thing to mention. It does take some sacrifice sometimes. When you want these kinds of jobs, you've got to make concessions, right? And compromise. Absolutely. Thanks so much, Niki. Brent, what would you like to add?
Sure. Thanks, Tammy. Thanks, Niki. I think you're right. Compromises are important. So I said before that I've been in the position of hiring contractors, specifically freelance writers. So I've had a lot of experience in this space. I've had a lot of frustrations in this space. And one of the easiest tips I'm going to give everybody out there is that every organization, at least with the UN, most of them have an internal process they have for hiring contractors. In other words, there's a place that they will put that you have to fill out a number of documents that places you on a roster. That then, if I'm looking for a writer, I then pick from that organization. So from that roster. So the first thing I would recommend, find out what that is. If you want to work with the UNEP, what is that? If you want to work with UNFCCC, what is that? That one I do know. Is the process arduous for putting on your information and getting on that? Yes, of course it is. It's the UN. everything is long and arduous to try and get onto these rosters. But then I'd have to ask you this. If you're not willing to put in the time and deal with bureaucracy, maybe you're not right for the UN. I mean, that's the other, I'm not, you know, it's a process that is long. When you're filling out that roster, and make sure that you do a good job. Spell everything correctly. I see a spelling mistake on mine and I throw it out. If I'm hiring you to be a speechwriter, if I'm hiring you to be a communications expert, if you have a spelling mistake, I'm not hiring you. I'm sorry. The other thing is that make sure you fill everything out, because you don't know if there's a roster, they can hire you for a number of different spots as well within the organization. It isn't necessarily restricted to communication. So fill everything out as much as you can. And then I think then you can contact the person in the organization to ask them questions. Again, if you send me an email, don't just send me a resume, say, I've always loved speechwriting, I think this is great. No, tell me, I'm looking for two things if I'm hiring a speechwriter or if I'm hiring a communications consultant. One, have you worked specifically in this space? Have you any speechwriting, climate change, communications experience? I'm willing to work with somebody to a certain extent, but when it's busy, I don't have that time. So second is, do you need minimal hand-holding? That I need to see that information up front. So it sounds, I sound like I'm being overly picky, but I'm telling you, this is also what people will look for when they're there. Make sure it's all filled out, make sure it's correct, and make sure it's to the point, and make sure you have those writing samples. That's it for me.
I'd like to follow up on a couple of things that you just mentioned, Brent. One of them is that, and it responds to one of the questions I saw in the Q&A, which is, can you get a job if you haven't had a perfect amount of experience in the climate sector? And so it's true that a lot of these organizations are looking for that long-term, like you've done communications in, as a volunteer, you've done communications as an intern, you've done it in your degree programs, you've had some initial experiences. That's the ideal scenario, right? And I was told that by a recruiter from one of the UN systems once. I showed her my resume and she said, no, there's no way we would hire you. You do not have that continuity of experience. However, I was able to get a communications role. I was offered 2 different positions when I was searching, and that was all I needed. So, I think it does depend on the organization you want to go and work for. And if you don't have that background, sometimes what can help is jumping in as a consultant in the short term and getting one of these short-term contracts, which even if you don't have the perfect background, so to speak, for a permanent position, you might have exactly what they need for a consulting position if, as Brent said, you don't need much hand-holding, if you can hit the ground running. There's something else, Brent, you mentioned a couple times. If you're looking for a speechwriter, you want them to have 0 flaws. There should be no writing errors in their CV and in any of their documents, on LinkedIn, their CV, their list of references. It should all be perfect. When I'm looking for someone who's going to be managing my social media, or I'm looking for someone who's going to be doing graphic design, their resume should be aligned perfectly. There shouldn't be any random spaces that are, or like tabs or misalignments. That drives me absolutely crazy, and I will eliminate resumes just based on the visuals if that person has a role that's going to have anything to do with graphic design or layout, visual layout. So I see Rune has something to say also on this. So go ahead, Rune.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I do think there's, especially if this is a permanent position, I think there's a little bit more room to maneuver on the contract side at times. I know there's different levels here. So Brent and in the top of the COP negotiators might be a little bit more picky than other places. But it's also of course your application is your first product. You need to demonstrate that you can communicate. It's as simple as that, in my view. And then it comes down to what are you applying for? Now, I was like Niki is now. I was a contractor with the UN, and it might be easier to get in that way. It does have its negative impacts as well. It can be, down to 3 months at the time, and breaks in between, and no pay all of a sudden. And there might be the UN is very structured, but that's not very structured. So that can be definitely an issue. So do find your way in, as Niki did as an intern, as an UNV, getting your foot inside the door. That's extremely important. You can do that as a contractor too. You can do that as a freelance writer who's just hired for an assignment, maybe. That will get you a foot in the door. And when building on Brent's, that you need to be able to prove that you can hit the ground running without any hand-holding, make sure to demonstrate that from whatever experience you do have, even outside of climate. And we all know that climate affects everything. So it's a matter of communicating that it's not a sector transfer, a large leap. It's an overlap. And how can you do that? And that's really one of your key messages in your application, that this is not a huge chance people are taking. You are just next door.
Right.
Yeah.
There's something I want to add to that, because it responds to some of the questions that I've seen about this transition that people might be making from outside to inside. And, maybe not everyone in the audience is a communicator, but it is important when you're transitioning to become a communicator for the transition, your career transition. And what I mean by that is you need to look at what the jobs are that you're applying for and see, you need to know that you can do those jobs. If your CV, your resume, doesn't reflect what is on that job description, you're not going to get the job. But if you know you can do that work, you just need to translate those, you need to copy and paste those words into the spots of your resume where you did that work. It might have been in a different sector, so it might be called something different, right? So if someone was, for example, I have been a public school, high school teacher. And you know what that is? That is running a meeting. That is project management. And so I can talk about project management and running meetings, no problem. And I can highlight that on my resume. So it's just an example. But the idea here, and this is advice that I've received from a number of career counselors, you've got to translate what you've done in the past in those other sectors into the language that your audience understands. And your audience are the hiring managers, right? And so the hiring managers need to know that you can do the job that they've asked, and just get those words into your resume where it's honest, where you honestly have done those things. And you can talk about volunteer opportunities that you're volunteering, that you've done. And you can put these things onto your resume to make sure that they are highlighting what you can do. And so I'd like to shift gears, unless there was another person. No, it was Niki had something to say. Before we shift gears, I want to jump to Niki because she had her hand up earlier, unless the answer has already been said.
I really wanted to say what you just said about tailoring your application according to the job and putting the time there. It goes a long way. And you can, it's all about framing.
That's so great. Yeah, it's all about framing. Exactly. So this next question goes back to our discussion on networking. One of the questions from the Q&A, one of the people mentioned that this discussion hasn't really touched on who you're supposed to talk to. So Rune, when you talked about networking, you said, well, be careful because the people might not be able to help you. So if there are people who can't help you, who should job seekers talk to? And so my gut instinct is people on the same level as you, not the hiring managers, but people who are at the same level of where you're going to be. They'll have more time than the hiring managers, and they will have a capacity of being more honest, I think, about the experience versus the hiring managers who need to have a very strong filter. So Sophie, would you get us started here? And then I'd like to hear if anyone else has some specific suggestions for who you can network with.
Thanks, Tammy. I'm actually gonna take a step back a little bit because I think, at least in my opinion, networking is important, but it's just one part of the process. And as Brent said earlier, I would, especially if you're at the beginning of your career, I would focus more on putting energy into doing a great CV. That takes time, that takes effort, making sure that you package your experience, as Niki has said as well, package your experience in a way that makes sense to the hiring manager. Make sure that you get your CV proofread so that there's no spelling mistakes or that it doesn't look funky. Like I agree with you, Tammy. It's just that's a big no for me as well. Write your cover letter, write it in a way that's engaging, like prep, rehearse, build a portfolio. I think that's really the first step. And also do your research. Do your research on the priorities of the organization that you're working, that you're applying to, the priorities of the team that you're applying to. Check their social media, see what language they use, and reuse some of that language in your CV and your cover letter. Same, look at the language that's used in the job ad and reuse some of that language in your application. To me, that's really the first step. If you don't have that ready, then your networking attempts might fall flat, because then when you manage to speak to someone and they will ask all of this from you, then you're not going to have a convincing package to provide. So that's just what I wanted to say. But then back to you, Tammy, for the discussion more on networking.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Niki, jump right in.
Thanks. I think we're lucky to have LinkedIn. And it's a good tool to use. And like everyone said, like use the tactics, but also tapping into your network. Like if you like someone said previously, they reached out to I think it was Tammy, people who work in that organization, and perhaps they could give you a link to someone else who is more relevant to speak to on a specific job. And I would like also encourage you to go to networking events or things that are accessible to you, where people may be there, and at there is like the art of networking, and it's about building a connection, not going and asking for something, because people don't want that. They want to have a genuine conversation, and that goes a further way. And I think it's your social capital. You build it over your whole life, so you can start it already, and you never know when that connection will be helpful. And so it's treating everyone with respect and throughout your journey, and not shying away from networking.
That's so smart. I really like your idea or your suggestion to go to in-person meetings. That's one of the ways I met a number of different people who helped leverage my hiring process in a number of organizations. I can't recommend that enough. It's a great idea. Brent, I see you've got your hand up. What would you like to add here?
Sure. And great answer, Nick. I really like that. It really is a long journey that has to be constantly maintained. One thing not to do, and two suggestions. So it triggered something that I remembered from a CUP event that I went to, and as a speechwriter, I'd also walk around with the executive secretary to some of her events, and I remember people thinking that maybe she could just do a hire on the spot while they were at the CUP, would try and shove business cards in her face about either their projects or for a job. I guarantee you that is about the worst approach to networking that you can do. That's simply not going to work. So don't do something like that. But what you could do, it's a bit of an addition to attending some events. I think that it helps to, I'm thinking more in terms of speech writing here and delivering speeches, have a core speech ready to go. You're an expert in something, right? There are Rotary clubs, there are volunteer organizations, school boards, whatever. They host annual general meetings. You're an expert in something. Maybe you're an expert in bringing people together. Maybe you're an expert in how to craft the perfect press release. Have a 5-minute to 10-minute speech ready to go that you can volunteer to give wherever. Why? Because afterwards, well, A, the focus is on you. B, you're shaking hands with people afterwards. And the second thing I would suggest, volunteer at events. I know the CUP, for example, when it was held here in Bonn, they were looking for lots of volunteers. There's volunteers for most conferences. And it helps, even if you're at a conference where it's not necessarily your field. I can tell you from being a speechwriter at these events, if you're sitting with a bunch of policy analysts, they've been talking to each other forever. And if you go around the table and they say, what do you do? I'm a speechwriter. Really? You know, it's a different thing. You bring a different focus. And so just, you know, that old adage that success is whatever percentage of showing up. I've never seen a formal study on that. So those are a few suggestions there.
Great. I want to jump in on what you just said. It's so important, and it responds to some of the questions that I've seen in the Q&A come in. So you mentioned getting out there and volunteering. And if someone is living in a place that isn't Bonn, right, and they can't go to COP, right, because it's really far away, I would recommend going to find the organizations that are locally working on climate change. So this responds also to the need for, how do I get experience if I'm transitioning in? If you can show on your resume that you've been a volunteer for a climate-oriented or sustainability organization, that's huge. It's really important to mention that and highlight it on your resume. And so going out there and volunteering for the local organizations, your city might have an individual who is managing the transition. Talk to them, see what you can do to support them. So really going out and meeting the people in your environment can help you get those volunteer roles that you then put on your resume. And Brent, you also mentioned having some speeches prepared. This is really important. Write things. You don't have to wait for someone to ask you to write them. You go ahead and write them. I did this once, and it was a LinkedIn. You can actually go back on LinkedIn and see the article that I wrote. Highly recommend writing your own pieces. You can publish them or not. I also have a website, tammymayer.com, and I have all of my writing samples that I think are worth highlighting from my academic experience. If you're a communicator, show off what you've done, make it look good. And so these are some of the ways you can start off your career showing that you have experience, even if it's made up experience that you've gone out and created on your own. Niki, what would you like to jump in here and say?
Thanks. Just a quick one that also you probably attended like university, and that's also another network you could tap into, because like the alumni network of your universities and other institutions you've been involved with, that's another way to find connections that and then you're able to connect on something that you've both done, which is go to that same uni or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good point. Very good point. Thanks. Does anyone else want to jump in on this, or should I go to the next question? We're almost out of time. We've got to wrap this up. I'm so sorry to see that time just disappear. So as I look at the time, we cannot go on to another question. I cannot ask you any more of these amazing questions that have come in. There will be a follow-up email, and we will try to get some of those questions that you've asked answered in the follow-up email. And we might just need to do a follow-up event for all of these fantastic questions that have come in. So thank you to Niki, Brent, Rune, and Sophie for being here, dedicating your time to this event, and answering these really important questions for job seekers. Thank you very much. Bravo. And I want to mention before we jump off this call that I will be sending out an email to everybody. You will get a link to watch this recording if you prefer to do it that way. You'll get links in there, like I said, of some of the answers that we didn't get to. And I want to mention that I'm also giving one climate action 20% off code in that email. So for those of you who want to get a training and learn more about communicating on climate change or sustainability issues, it's a communications training. You won't learn about science, climate change in these trainings. You learn about communicating. It's 20% off. You'll get that in your follow-up email. And that can also be a really good thing to put on your CV to say that you have some experience and knowledge in climate communications. So at that, I really thank you all for being here. And I wish you a wonderful job search, all the success in the world, and a wonderful rest of your day. Take care, everybody.